Hello, friends, fellow deviants. Welcome to Topography. I'm your host, Ashley Hoden, and today I'm talking with Bradley Cantrell. He is the chair and professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia, and his research and teaching focuses on digital film, simulation, and responsive technologies to examine landscape form, process, and phenomenology. He's also co-authored 4 books: Digital Drawing for Landscape Architecture, Modeling the Environment, Responsive Landscapes, and Codify most recently. It was a really fun conversation, and my first encounter with Brad was back in, I think it was like 99 or 2000, something like that. I was a 4th-year student at the CSU program in CSU Landscape Architecture program. Some friends drove to Kentucky and saw Brad speak. It's all part of. We'll cover it in the podcast, but came across him, and he's maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 years older than me, not too much more. But back then, so I was 22 maybe, and he was 24, 25, presenting to a bunch of us students, and he was so far ahead of where I was at. It was pretty mind blowing, and he's kind of stuck out in my memory ever since then. So I was really excited to talk with him this week, and it was a great conversation. We discuss a lot of his work. Well, we discuss in detail some of his work, which has become the main focus of his work, involving AI technology and machine learning and their applications in the landscape and in the greater ecosystem and just the earth itself. So in the way that wearables and kind of the future of technology is discussed pretty widely, being embedded in the human body and sort of biologically, he's approaching it as in a similar way, almost with the earth itself, where technology starts to become part of and integrated with the earth itself. Very cool. He's a really interesting guy, very fun and enjoyable person to speak with as well. So, and there was a technology issue that I am not sure where it happened. We had no signal in talking, but for some reason, the last 10 or 15 minutes of my audio and video cut out. So you'll see that the conversation kind of ends abruptly, and that's why, because we lost a bit of the tail end of it. I'm going to look into fixing it and how that will not happen again in the future, but I hope you enjoy what is there. Just a note that you can find all the podcast episodes on the deviation.us website. They are available in video on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble. Those are the 3 main, and then audio in Apple, Amazon, Google, all the other stuff. Like us and review us, and tell all your friends. Anyhow, thank you. Bye. Well, I wanted to start actually because it's a kind of an interesting story. I guess it relates to how my path into landscape architecture. But when I was studying, I studied at Colorado State, and it's a 5-year program. And I think it was my 4th year. I took a trip to Kentucky with 4 of my classmates. We jumped in my car and we drove from Colorado to Kentucky and did this whole road trip. And we ended up at Labash in Kentucky. I think it was 99, 2000, somewhere around in there.
Gotcha.
And I mean, it was, for me, just overall, it was a great experience, doing the road trip and being part. It was the first time as a student, I saw other students in the program and kind of saw the bigger world.
Yeah.
But I remember your presentation, it was the main presentation I remembered. I don't know that I remember too much else of what was there, but I think part of it was that you were maybe like 2 years. I don't know. You're not much beyond me age-wise, but you were like light years beyond me in terms of as a student and as a practitioner of landscape architecture. And I remember sitting there just going like, holy shit, man. Like, I don't know. Landscape architecture doesn't come naturally to me. It took a lot for me to work my way into it. Yeah. But I just remember, so the things that I remember, and I don't know, there was a professor who introduced you, and I don't know if it was part of your presentation or her mentioning it, but she's you had done a senior project as an undergrad at Kentucky that was like a study of, I think it was a chair or furniture that involved um, the ergonomics of it, and it was just like a whole semester that you had devoted to doing that.
Yeah, yeah. We actually built them out of cardboard, I believe, at the time. You know what I mean? Like in like kind of hard packed cardboard. You know.
Oh wow, yeah. So, but I just remember that as sort of an aside. But then you presented a device, I believe, that was I think it was somewhat like a sculpture or like a public kind of. It was vertical
Yeah,
and
yeah,
had dimension, and it told time in multiple different ways.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's been a long time, man.
Yeah, it was ages ago. So your name has been in my head since then,
Gotcha.
and so
That's
it's
a
I
long
don't know.
time
I
ago.
just wanted to share that because it was a very pivotal experience for me.
Those Labash conferences for me too, though, like as a young student going to other schools and meeting everybody, just seeing the kind of diversity of people studying landscape architecture and the different programs, they were always big moments for me. You know, what I mean, we went to one in Madison, Wisconsin one year, and
Uh,
yeah, that one was great. I mean, you met Herbert Dreisaitl at the time, and like got all kind of excited about water, and because of his talk. But those are fun moments.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great. I don't know. I just like that aspect of the programs and studying.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know. We would bring speakers to our school sometimes too, but that was the first time to really get involved in the bigger community. Um, well, I looked at some of the articles that you had shared. I'm I don't know. I'm really excited to talk about this because you seem to be on the kind of forefront of a lot of the technological aspects of the profession,
mm,
and particularly with like the AI language learning and some of the other things that are now becoming even more prescient to greater society.
mm,
Um, so I wanted to jump into that, and one of the things that also with climate change, because it's such a big topic now too, and me personally coming out of COVID and looking at sort of climate change, let's say, as another, I don't know whether like urgent pressing issue that can be
yep,
catastrophized.
yep,
I'm very concerned about the politics of it, where
right,
it could be used to induce fear and then implement policies that are detrimental that then also don't solve the issue.
right,
And
yep,
so one of the articles that you shared, I found to be very prescient in the face of that because it discusses the idea of climate change as not a problem to be resolved,
right,
um, and that the approach to modeling and how we assess risk and how we kind of learn about the earth
yep,
can ultimately kind of like be inverted to this collection of massive data where you lose sight of the bigger picture.
exactly, yep,
And so I wanted to maybe break into that. And in terms of the idea of it not being an issue to be resolved, it's not like it's not a problem. It's that it's not a problem with a solution per se.
exactly, yeah. It's a condition.
Is yes,
Yep,
yeah.
yep,
And you brought up succession, extinction, ocean biochemistry, ice migration.
hmm,
These are key aspects of this condition,
right,
and that will be in flux.
right, right. And it's up to us how we engage, begin to engage that, right? There's a
Yes.
I think I can talk maybe about it even on like a longer kind of arc of kind of thinking that's come about through my work that's kind of led to this. To I think that the paper you're talking about that Marantha Dawkins and I put together for the Bartlett.
Wild
Part-
disequilibria.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Part of this has been very much around. My earlier interests in my work were all around ideas around representation. How do we use media? How do we create models? And important and most kind of like pressing in that was like how computation was the tool that would allow us to do new things in terms of representation. And if we think of climate change in some ways as it's a product of representation, right? We've begun to develop the tools to sense a changing climate. We have the historical data to begin to put that together, and we're then getting excited about that. We are developing a whole range of ways to represent climate change that are building new knowledge around what it even is, right? And so those are still models and illustrations, essentially, or visualizations of this data that we are curating and developing these narratives around the changing climate. Now, in that paper, there's nothing in there saying, I'm not a disbeliever in climate change, but there is something about our approach that I do find problematic, and I find part of this idea of there being solutions is that it's oftentimes commodified, which is another set of issues. But it also oversimplifies our role as humans, kind of in a very complex kind of ecology of elements on the planet, right? And so if we think of it as a solution, we kind of tackle it in one way. But if we think of it as a condition we're living in and living through, I think it reshapes us as human beings and as societies in ways that are much different. Our approaches become much different, and it becomes less about remediation and pure mitigation, and it becomes much more about tactics for how we live with a planet that's going to be different in the next 100 to 200 years, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The other parts of this is that it also forces us to possibly approach it in a way that's not about this kind of, I would say, a modernist concept of how we approach complex systems, and that's through just prediction. Like somehow we think we're going to predict the future, and that we're going to do the work today to change that future that we're predicting through our forms of representation, our models, our simulations, and things like this. So I think there's I think that in that paper, we try to reframe the kind of issues in that way, because I think it talks about a different type of landscape practice, right? It talks about one that's uses computation, it uses different forms of remote sensing and monitoring, forms of simulation as ways to ideally get at the kind of material aspects of the planet and how we begin to engage those material aspects, right? And that and it's much more about a kind of a form of doing that produces knowledge, as opposed to a set of representations that produce knowledge that we act upon, right? So it becomes a more kind of active and applied form of engaging climate that that then produces new knowledge through those forms of engagement. Yeah,
one of the ideas that I really liked tied in with that is this notion of like control Earth, and a lot of the modeling and data collection is sort of done with a mind towards sort of like establishing what the ideal condition is,
right?
This sort of static condition that's ideal that we need to go back to, that we've destroyed over the course of our infringement on these processes,
right?
And that the Earth is, regardless of our input to it, is a dynamic thing that changes dramatically.
Yep.
And I think one of the interesting ideas is that, so we're in this 12,000 year epoch, let's say, since the last ice age, that has its own fluctuations and its own history where, sea levels have risen and maybe dropped and have done this and that. Temperatures have gone up and down. That we get sort of, I don't know what the right word is I'm looking for, sort of paralyzed almost by our own quest to define this condition, as opposed to working forward, like you say, tactically.
Yep.
And the fact that we're now at this moment where we're dramatically altering an already unstable situation that leads to a lesser ability to even predict where it's going.
Right. Exactly. Yep. I think this, I trace it back to a whole range of things, and maybe it's also one of those things where I see it in everything. So this is my own issue of like, my own version of representation. It's like, how my mind sees the world now. But, there is as we begin to develop these models, they become the thing, essentially. If I'll just put it that way, right? And so, as we develop a kind of complex model, we might use a physics-based model to kind of model kind of a fluvial system. In a way, the model and what it produces is the truth, and then we come back and we bend the world to kind of to adhere to that new truth. And I think this is something in climate change. The issue here is it's so complex, and it's so large in scale. How we would engage this pseudo truth is that's the fool's errand, right? It's like we're suddenly in this place where we've made it up, and now we have to go act on it. And it doesn't mean that the planet isn't actually changing in terms of its climate, and there is action needs to happen. But we've told a story about it now, and that's the way the planet needs to actually change for us, right? And so I think there's a step back from that I've been trying to do, particularly in terms of my work in kind of coastal resilience and kind of around kind of coastal modeling and most importantly how we develop design tools and make propositions around those systems. That backs away from this idea that if we have the perfect model, we can then find the perfect solution. And I think that's the route, that's the kind of asymptotic kind of curve we're heading towards, or we think we're heading towards. When in reality, I think that prediction curve is actually can be way off very quickly. You know what I mean? And it's there's lots of people that have written about this. I mean, the kind of topics around kind of anti-fragility and things like this also, you know what I mean? So it's but this kind of notion that prediction is our only way forward is, I think, one that I came to kind of grips with maybe a decade ago now. When I first got into these kind of more complex kind of modeling tools, it's seems like that would be the way to go. But when you really think about it, what are we making? We're making another version of the world that we're going to rely on to tell us what's in front of us, right? It seems even a bit more bizarre when you start to think of it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually is the nexus that is scariest to me politically, where that is taken and then put into a political structure that just has other interests that start to get folded into that.
Yeah.
How did you 10 years ago or so, how did you get into this? How was this a turn in your work?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's all about my time in Louisiana, quite honestly. And so when I left grad school, I worked for several years in Boston, and then got convinced to come down to Louisiana for academic position. Elizabeth Mossop was the one that really convinced me to come down there. And, I went down there with this idea around, kind of, I would say, what was that? That was like 2000s, early 2000. And really this idea that, models were, these architectural models, they're formal, you know what I mean? You're making kind of topographic form from them. And really kind of barely touching on these ideas of like physical, kind of fluvial models, right? So seeing some of the work that Hargraves had done many years before on the Guadalupe River, and then coming to Louisiana, there were a lot of these kind of big models that people were using to kind of understand the Mississippi River in particular. And the more I began to do research when I was there, those models, and when you look at the history of them, and Christy Sheremy, who's at Ohio State now, she was at Louisiana State University when I was there. She wrote a really beautiful piece in, I think it might be Places or Design Observer, about the Mississippi Basin model, which you may be familiar with the Basin model, but it's that, it's this model that the Army Corps of Engineers or the Hydrologic Engineering Control Center built, but it's, like 60-acre model, represents the whole Mississippi River watershed, made of concrete, in different panels. And they would basically use it to run simulations, but the whole river was modeled basically on friction coefficients, so Manning coefficients. So it's all just about how fast water moves across surfaces. And so, you can imagine what that does is it immediately frames an entire watershed and the management of that entire watershed as a way to control the edges of the river, right? So like, can we make sure that river stays at a constant velocity so it doesn't back up and flood? And then we're going to engineer those edges so that that velocity is maintained. And that model, one thing you find with that is the model. Well, we probably know the Mississippi River is, it's a river that's cut through the land, for years and years and years. But the chunk of the model that was built in the late 1930s and into the 50s, 60s, the form they made then is the form of the river today, because it's they made that model and then they ran the simulations over and over on that model. And they use that as a way to build the levees, to kind of to use that form as a way to basically test different scenarios. And the river's been kind of held in place with essentially concrete mats that are replaced, over and over again to keep the Mississippi River in its place. And it behaves the way the model behaved. It's like it does what it's told. And so that's that didn't just play out over a moment. That played out over 8 years for me, kind of finally understanding like what that model had done, and the fact that model then created a lot of the numerical models and the computational models that we use. To understand these rivers. So the Mississippi River is a very complex system, but you start to see it through the lens of the basin model, and essentially what the whole project was about at the time was about reducing the variables so that it was all about controlling friction and the speed of water, right? And that's what keeps New Orleans safe. It keeps Baton Rouge safe. It keeps St. Louis and other places safe, or safe-ish. They still flood every now and then, but much less than before. So that kind of led over like a long story. It also then brought me back to my grad school days whenever we did this studio at the GSD on the LA River. And really understanding that, as those first numerical models were coming together and physical models, that trapezoidal channel of the LA River, it's the perfect, perfect kind of conveyor for water, right? And so it doesn't slow it down. It keeps it at a constant speed. And you realize, we've done it in a very straightforward way with the LA River. And you can see it right in front of you. That river has been made exactly the same profile, for miles and miles and miles through the city, in order to keep it from flooding, right? And so you've gotten rid of all the variables of how the river functions, and you know exactly what it's going to do and where every drop of water is going to go in it. So that's where I come back to what I was saying before about climate change. This idea that we make the model or our understanding of the system. And we have the power and the kind of finesse now in terms of our kind of technology and our infrastructures to essentially reshape the Earth based on that representation, right? And I'm oversimplifying here a bit, but that conceptually was something that came about through this kind of long-term relationship with the Mississippi River and the Mississippi Basin model, and understanding kind of how the Army Corps of Engineers had worked there, And you have to applaud the Army Corps. It's like they've reshaped the river and made it into something that is, people. New Orleans is decently safe. Obviously, Hurricane Katrina was a tough one, but overall, it's we know what the Mississippi River is going to do every year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they took these physical models as a way to essentially optimize for like one or two factors, and then
exactly
use those as the factors that you designed for, and it's still in the world. And prior to having like a computerized or digital way of studying fluid dynamics and setting these different parameters that you're trying to optimize for, it was physical.
Yeah. And so they would adjust these Manning coefficients or the friction coefficients on the edges of the model. So they had multiple ways to do that. And in some portions of the model, they would just cast aggregate directly into the concrete, right? And so you would have like a bumpy surface They also had like wire mesh that they would use to as a land cover type, like for forest. They would they also had other portions that were more variable. They had like essentially brass plugs, and they could screw in long or short ones into the edges of the river profile to kind of slow down or speed up the water. And so part of the way they tuned that also, which was pretty interesting from what I understand, is they had historical data, right? So they knew from from river gauges how the river performed at certain times, how much water was coming in through certain tributaries. And they would use that historical data, and these were all on kind of punch card rolls, and they would open and close the valves on the entire watershed, and then they would adjust the manning or the coefficients in order to get the river or the model to perform like the historical data, right? And so once they tuned it to the historical data, they felt like, okay, now it's a predictor of future conditions, now that it's able to produce the past, right? And so that then became the predictor of the future, but that also became the recreator of the Mississippi River itself, right? So the model becomes where the life of the river is, and the river itself, it has to follow what the model's doing.
Yeah, yeah. God, that's so. Then you have built from that to then go to use now digitally computers, technology, algorithms to build from that history essentially in making riverways, adding maybe more factors into it, like ecological considerations, climate considerations.
Yep.
Subsidence, that was one with
Yep.
adding these features that allow the sedimentation to drop in the right places so that it actually creates
Yep.
land.
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of that is, if we think of the river as a condition also, right? So the river is its own, you could even call it its own agent, but it's, multiple agents working together, or working against each other, however you want to see them. There's a point in that where, one thing that I've been trying to work through is like, if we're not predicting the future, how are we engaging, in the environment today in ways that allow us to kind of operate at scales that we haven't operated at before, right? And to do that in ways that aren't about saying this is what it's going to look, this is what we want it to look like, and so we're going to form it, we're going to make it behave for us to do that. But instead, like, what is the kind of back and forth that we can begin to have with these complex systems? And there's multiple things that I think are important about that. And I won't pretend to say that I figured this out. It's more about kind of rethinking kind of the way we might design or the way we might kind of construct the world around us. But part of that has been around this kind of quest in terms of computation as a way of sensing different forms of environmental phenomena, and then using that as ways to react or kind of change the system based on that kind of picture of the real-time situation, right? And so essentially developing a real-time model that we can then begin to react to and then immediately see the results, and begin to then adapt to that and then make the next move, right? So rather than predicting everything, it's about what's the smallest change we can make that we can then learn from, produce some form of new knowledge, but also develop a relational aspect with the river as an entity and kind of human control as an entity, right? And so that's kind of the space I've been trying to work within. And then what does design mean in that, right? Like what's design authorship mean within that realm? So for me, that's a really interesting place to be. It is about outcomes, but really it's about kind of guiding and continually working with that system in ways that are you could use words like symbiotic or relational, right? That when the river changes, for example, in these small ways, we as kind of human beings develop new intuitions about what we're seeing and what we're doing, and our kind of computational intelligences are also today learning from that as well, right? And so that kind of weird new relationship is the place where probably some of the papers I sent you are living in, right? Is that what is this relationship we're starting to make for ourselves that we're partially aware of, and in some cases, other cases we're guiding it, and other points we're just discovering, oh wait, this is actually changing the way we even see the world around us.
Yeah, That's what it's so. This is the part. I mean, it's very exciting for me that this space. One of the reasons is the time component. Like, so you're operating at a different scale, but it's also extending the consideration of time in a new way.
Yeah.
Both
That's a good way
both
to put it.
immediate because there's like an ongoing monitoring and give and play.
Yeah.
But then a longer term picture for like, I don't know that it's an ultimate vision for what it becomes, but like ultimate sort of relationship that is allowed to take form over time.
Yeah.
It's kind of a relational way of designing as opposed to sort of like initiating, like here's the thing, take it, run, it's done.
Right.
You know, and maybe the trees grow over time and we'll maintain it and stuff, but beyond that, time isn't really like there's not an ongoing back and forth.
Yep. Yeah.
I think also one of the key considerations is just to bring up is the notion of complexity versus complication. I think a lot of the politics and a lot of the modeling stuff approaches it as though it's like a complicated problem.
Yep.
Whereas complexity is all these intertwining systems where, you know, 3 systems could go haywire, the whole thing reestablishes balance, or, you know, there's all these different factors, or one system could go haywire and pull all of it with it. You know, like there's a load of different things going on that you can't sort of necessarily isolate a variable here or there and it'll have an explanation for the overall.
Right.
But like an engine, you can know that the alternator's out. It's complicated, you fix it, but everything else is going to be running again fine, you know?
Yeah.
And so where that is becoming even more exciting is the idea of having basically self-governed, well, not self-governed, but like computer-governed with some interplay with humanity landscapes, ecologies, using like AI learning and maybe deployment of intelligent robots or however this stuff is tended to. But it's I'd never heard this idea, and I am so intrigued by it. And I like even just how it's implemented is interesting. Like how, the idea of going from let's say a intelligent software that is able to sort of monitor and be like a command hub for an ecology, not say but just one.
Yeah. How
it then just does it, like sends the words and distributes its orders and things like that.
Yeah.
And then it brings into questions there too what you're optimizing for.
Yeah. Right.
But I'd be curious about just thoughts on that in general and some of the vision for what could happen there.
So I think, that space for me is really interesting in a couple of ways. Like one, it gets back to like the tools itself, like, working with the tools themselves in terms of machine learning tools and mostly machine learning tools, some artificial intelligence stuff, but mostly machine learning tools. For me, there's an interesting piece to it that is, we go back to this kind of relational idea, right? That there's enough kind of black boxed in it that you can have a kind of actual kind of collaboration or relationship with the tool itself, right? And so that there's, I won't even call them mistakes, but there is it's always interesting when you collaborate with someone who isn't they're not just like you, right? They don't think just like you. And so this idea of working with these tools with someone who doesn't think like me and doesn't really even speak my language, but can produce a product that I can relate to and I can then push back on. That's a really interesting way for me, in my mind, for humans to kind of expand the way we think about the world around us, right? And think about our kind of relationships with different intelligences. So that one aspect for me is really interesting. And I think, some of the work we do in the lab here really looks at kind of design tools and how machine learning, plays a role there. The other part, though, that I find just totally fascinating is, this was started as a conversation between Earl Ellis and Laura Martin and I many years ago, like 2015 or so, before we wrote that Designing Autonomy paper. But we were we were all kind of at Harvard at the same time, and I had gone back there teaching, and Earl was teaching landscape ecology courses, and Laura was finishing her PhD, I believe, or was in a postdoc, I forget. And we're all just like chatting around the kind of geomorphology model I had at the time, and part of that was talking about how we were using sensors to kind of make these weird like sediment diversions and things like that, and how we were making these little robotic systems. And we started to talk about like how we didn't know exactly what the sediment gate was doing at the moment, you know what I mean? But it was doing something interesting. And then this whole conversation around wilderness and wildness came up. And then thinking about like, you know, we typically think of this engagement with the world around the environment around us as about humans' perception of that world, right? And it's, you know, how do we see it as nature, or how do we see it as cultivated lands, or like all these definitions we give it. But, you know, what if there was another intelligence, you know what I mean, that had its own ability to begin to make these types of alterations? It had its own logics, right? We might start from kind of a human set of goals, but then it has its own way of achieving those goals. And you're probably familiar with this, like the AlphaGo project that like Google did, and to play the game of Go. But the, you know, the part of that conversation was also this, just the fascinating thing that came out of that was that, you know, the game of Go had been played for thousands of years, and this like this machine intelligence learned new ways that no one had ever seen to play this game. You know what I mean? Like humans had never discovered it, and it was, you know, it's and so the fact that that was possible to me like opened up a whole new kind of realm that you know, what if these entities, and I won't pretend to know how they're cultivating the land yet or any of those things, because I think that gets into a whole nother set of kind of issues. But whatever it is, they're able to have an influence on the land in a way that they're cultivating it like with their own logic, and all we can understand as human beings is that it's some form of nature, right? That it's highly altered, highly choreographed, highly cultivated, but we don't even understand the intelligence behind it, right? We can't even understand the patterns, none of those things, right? And so it becomes some form of wildness to us, right? And that we engage it as though it has this kind of purity to it, you know? And that's that kind of thought experiment we just kind of ran with for like almost a year, and wrote this weird paper that somehow got accepted to an ecology journal.
It's fascinating. I mean, the concepts behind it are just incredible. I love it. I think it's probably more on point than we recognize it, you know?
I think we hit on something, you know, at the time it took all three of us to put our heads around that, you know, but it certainly hit on a moment, and it was really before things were even like people were really excited about machine learning and these things. And so we were having a lot of fun with it, but then also the more we talked about it, the more, like you said, I think it really like hit on some kind of real pressing issues that I think we're going to have to come to grips with in some ways, right? Like there's, you know, if we already kind of look at the way we manage kind of large scale systems. And if I go back to the Mississippi River again, just the way we control the spillways there, you know, we've reordered that whole kind of ecology, and we see it still as, there are portions of that we still see as, you know, like wilderness, you know, but these are places like the Atchafalaya Basin that are highly regulated by the way we allow water to move into that system. Even the ways we may kind of, you know, cull certain species and things like this. But it's still kind of understood as like a wild place, you know? And if we imagine that was happening outside of even our own like perception, that just becomes even more wild, I think, you know?
Oh, yeah. So the idea being that we set up, say, like a centralized intelligence, digital intelligence that is in control then of governing the earth, almost like any, and maintaining animal populations and plant populations, maybe nurturing food production, whatever the parameters are that it's operating within.
Yeah.
So as I was thinking about this idea, I found myself kind of drawn to like how does it work? Like if there is this centralized hub, is it like telling, like, is it even just sending off like a robot or something, and it's like kill these 3 wolves, and then protect these other here, these elephants over here, make sure that, like, and it could be to the point where it's as specific as which animals, like don't take that wolf, but take that wolf. There's an example of like invasive starfish that you use where it could go in and kind of like cull the ones that are depleting the reefs that are causing issues there. And it could be a similar thing in forests with like protecting certain species, promoting, but it's actually deploying entities of some sort that are doing work, and we don't necessarily even understand, but the result is, theoretically, is an ecosystem that functions both for the natural world, but then for our purposes, and creates sort of a harmony or sort of interplay between us that is more productive than if we did it and just sort of operated on our sort of freewheeling way.
Yeah.
That's not.
And I think, I think that's what's, there's a couple of different ways to think about this too, that I think are worth like kind of just as thought exercises to go through, because part of it can be about optimizing those systems, right? And that's one thing that could be happening. But you can think of like the codspot and the crown of thorns starfish, and this idea of a kind of autonomous drone moving through the water. It's finding these crown of thorns starfish. It's injecting them with a bile solution and killing them, right? And they're seen as invasive species that are killing off the barrier reef. But if that robot's kind of like, basically it's using like different forms of image analysis or image detection to find them and then kill them. But in that, if it has a way of kind of learning from its own actions, right, and the kind of larger system, which is what we're developing with these kind of machine learning systems, it could find a pattern where a certain hue of the crown of thorns starfish they are like greater. They have a greater appetite that we can't even really detect, and it doesn't really detect that. It just knows that by killing off more of those, the pattern changes, right? And so suddenly that intelligence gets built, and it starts acting in a way that it alters the whole kind of ecosystem just through its own kind of analysis and learning. I mean, the other versions of that too could even be as simple as, you could imagine almost an infrastructure that is almost like a gate that would, move Earth from one side, right, to the other. And it essentially allows, builds a new pattern in the landscape of moving water through it. And it has an ability to see what's downstream. And all it's doing is it's moving this large mass of Earth. We never really see that Earth move because it moves so slowly, right? For example, like I'm giving you an example. So suddenly there's this natural phenomena that builds these kind of new kind of wetland systems or lands that humans just assume are part of the way the Earth functions in a way, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And so there's so these things are becoming embedded in the ways these examples are a little kind of, kind of a little simple, but like the complexity of the way these interactions are occurring and the way the intelligences are actually gaining information, finding like playing AlphaGo, creating their own creativity in a way, and then finding their own like solution to it. That alone is, to me, as another agent out in the world, is an exciting, to me, slightly scary, but also a very exciting concept. And as designers, thinking about how we work with those systems is for me is exciting.
Oh, I'm just sitting here just listening. I was thinking about the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
Like if you had that situation, you could then have a river that's responsive to storms.
Yeah.
You rip out all the concrete and it just like expands when the rain comes, contracts.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just insane.
And importantly in that, it could be acting as one big unit. It could be acting as individual actors, but it's developing its own kind of patterns of interaction that are outside of like a completely known like way of operating, right? So right now, like if we're predicting how infrastructure needs to operate, we're designing it in a way that says it has to work within this range and do these functions. Like a system like this might find whole new ways to behave, but still produce the same goal, right? So like the goal could be that to protect this city, but it might find its own weird ways to do that, right? And what that does is at scale, it forms a whole new kind of landscape type or kind of ecological relationship.
God, that is so cool.
I love this conceptually, and I love and Zihao Zhang, who was here and is now at City College. Him and I we worked through these kind of ideas about this relationship between kind of human intelligence, computational intelligence, and biological intelligence, and kind of what that new kind of space might look like. We called that at the time like the third intelligence, this kind of computational intelligence. But part of that's so interesting, I think, is this idea that it has its own, without like anthropomorphizing it, it has its own creativity, right? It has its own way of finding its kind of set of solutions, right? And even we see this like with Chat GPT now and Midjourney and these other kind of machine learning tools. But in some ways, like the results are interesting because we can understand and relate to the results, but we don't really know how like we don't really need to know how Midjourney got the image, right? It just responded to our prompt in a way, and it's close enough that we can be intrigued, right? And that's that part alone is if you imagine that as in a kind of an environmental response, that is I think that's part of what we're excited about with nature anyways, right? Is that it has its own responses. The idea that it would be curated by this other intelligence as well is just a whole nother layer of intrigue for me.
Yeah. I heard recently that just this is a much simplified, reduced concept, but that they're developing using the facial recognition kind of AI technology, the ability to minimize insecticide and fertilizer use, reducing it by like 99 something drastic percent like that, to where they can go in and just target specific insects and specific plants with what they're,
That's amazing.
So and then you apply that, across the board in the earth, not that specific, but just the idea that those kinds of technologies are going to start being embedded in our, natural, I guess it's a convergence, both when you look at it on the human sense of human machine interface, and that we're likely going to some hybrid place where technology is embedded in us. It sounds like it's a similar thing with the earth itself, that it will become a hybrid of
right.
A planet in the universe with digital elements sort of like molding its surface.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I can, that's in my imagination somewhere, it's like this, that is definitely the, I think that space is one that I find really interesting. Is that this, this other intelligence, it's the other thing that's so interesting to me about this concept of the other intelligence is that, we often think of it as, a way of kind of optimizing our own kind of wants and needs, but we can also imagine it not as being harmful, but as also being resistant, and like productively resistant to human beings, right? And that to me is another space that I've tried to like get my head into, is like if you're designing as a landscape architect, kind of some sort of way of kind of interacting with the environment, but what would a form of resistance in that like be that would be productive for us, right? Like how would it maybe force us to kind of take the world in longer, or how might it like actually prevent us from kind of like doing certain actions, but rather than just stopping us, kind of giving us some sort of intrigue about why we should, and this kind of weird like productive, I use this word productive resistance as a way to think of maybe another kind of design like kind of move that we might begin to make.
Yeah. There's, God, I could almost see it being like uh, like it could initiate to where you can have anything you want. Imagine, I mean, like a person, like you're just given whatever you want at any moment in time.
Yep.
And is that good for you?
Yeah.
And it could be that other thing where it's like, no, you can't have everything you want. And there's a teaching moment here as a culture or as a species or whatever.
Yep.
And yeah, and it could be creative. Each one of these things could have its own creative way of doing it. Like you were saying with that Go example is the perfect example because, I mean, here's a game that's been played for millennia by, probably billions of people,
right.
Over thousands of years or whatever. Or at least 1,000 years. I don't know its full history, but, and then in like whatever span of computation, let's say going back to I don't know, the earliest that we've done, it's going back to the 40s or 50s or something. Yeah. So let's say in 50 years, this technology has then sort of overthrown a millennia of human thought on this game and revealed a whole new dimension that nobody's explored and nobody even knows how it figured it out.
Exactly. No, I mean, that's that when I first was reading about AlphaGo, that just blew my mind. I mean, that like, and if there's a documentary about it, but there's a really fun moment in that where like, essentially they're like, the announcers are like, well, it looks like, AlphaGo's, I mean, they're like, AlphaGo shit the bed here. It's like, it's really messed up this one. And then like, he's playing and then all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, like no one, it's like, and then he like just runs away with the rest of the match. It's like that, and you can see the look on, I forget the guy's name, Liesel Dan, or I forget his name, but he was just like blown away. I mean, you could tell he's like blown away. He's like dedicated his whole life to this game. And suddenly he's seeing things that he's never seen before. It's really, I mean, I'm a bit overemphasizing it, but I do think that as a kind of idea about this engagement between machine intelligence, the environment, and humans is something to really keep our eyes on and to like really be I won't even say wary of, because I don't believe we need to be scared of it, but to kind of understand what we're really like doing here and what we're getting into.
Yeah. So I mean, just kind of a side note, but like with this Chat GPT thing, I've tested it. I've heard some people talk about it and saying like, okay, well, give me a monologue in the voice of George Carlin, or write me a breakup note in the voice of Hemingway. Yeah. And it makes me think of like, okay, so if there's this sort of, let's say, thinking entity that is able to understand an artist's voice to the extent that it can replicate their style, is it starting to map the contours of that artist's mind? Like to be able to get into that person's mind enough to do that, Yeah. And then as it grows, assuming whatever it's doing to be able to do that, let's say in 20 years, I will be able to just sit down and say, write me an essay on this in the voice of Ashley Hoden, and from having grown up in the system and having sent all these emails and having had all these phone conversations, and this entity monitoring it from the day I'm born till the day whatever, right? Is it then able to use this whole like Kahneman nudge idea, or like this governmental thing where they're trying to promote certain behaviors by nudging, and is it able to prompt you just using certain words to put you into a certain emotional state? Yeah. Is it able to steer, like, and to what degree then are you malleable? And it's like the computer decides it wants you to be like the fundamentalist terrorist in some other part of the world, or it decides it wants you to be like the king of some small country, and you get there just by prompts that steer you into whatever course this computer wants you to go.
I mean, without going completely down like conspiracy theory rabbit holes and things like that, I mean, I think we see that through just our engagement with social media. You know what I mean? And human beings are highly malleable. We're very susceptible to these different mediums, and we're gullible, and we believe what we want to believe. I mean, like that's just in our nature, right? And so
Yeah.
I think without a doubt, like there is a in some ways, ChatGPT it's like we're holding a mirror up to our face, because it's basically like just mining humanity, right? And in order to speak to us, and so it's that alone, that kind of back and forth over time. I mean, that changes kind of how you do things. It's just like, let's say it's not even trying to be manipulative. Like it's that just those conversations with ChatGPT or like prompts with Midjourney. Those are relationships with that intelligence that, as I mentioned before, we don't really have to know how it got there. Its outcome is close enough that really we care about the outcome then. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that I find so interesting about it, is like, some of us are nerding out, like me, like wanting to know the back end, but a lot of us are, I mean, and me as well, like I'll just sit there and like play with it and think like, okay, this is an interesting conversation I'm having with nothing, you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, it's that alone is, that's changing me, and I think, obviously,
Yeah.
if it wanted to prompt you in certain ways and discover your kind of intricacies, that's certainly possible. I mean, and we've, I would dare to say, like whole political elections recently and things like this have been shaped through not necessarily machine learning, but through kind of deep looks at statistics and really targeted advertising, right? And that's kind of what you're talking about, right? And that's that being done though not for that single purpose, but as a whole way of sculpting kind of human societies, and doing it even on a slow roll as opposed to like for a very specific outcome. I mean, I don't see that being something that's actually not already kind of happening in the background of us. You know what I mean?
Oh, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
I would, these are stupid. This is a little bit of a stupid example, but something as simple as like Google Maps has completely changed my relationship with the world around us. You know what I mean? And that's not something that's trying to necessarily change me, but I was as a kid, like I had every road atlas, from across the United States. I lived in Europe. I had all the road atlases from every single state, every single country and big city. And I would study them. And like before I would go on a trip, I would study it for the week before. And like, I'd write down all the places I wanted to go. You know what I mean? Now, you know how it is now. You just grab your phone and get on the plane. You don't give two shits about like where you're going to land. You know what I mean? It's like, you're just going to get off and find the place to eat and find your hotel and you're good to go. So it's, in a weird way, you don't even look up anymore to take it all in. You kind of get led by the nose to the next destination, which I think that's a completely different relationship with the planet or the environment than we used to have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good example, actually. The more like just even now, I've thought about it in the past, but just hearing it now made me think about just that aspect of it. Because yeah, I did the same. I like to do road trips, and I would have all these maps in my car, and like I remember there was one where the road on the map just kind of like stopped, and it's like, why would it just stop there? There's a highway 2 feet next to it. It's like, there's no way this map is accurate. And then I go and and that's part of the fun. And you like then find your way out. You talk to somebody, hey, and just looking up and being in your space, having to find your way through it and figure it out was part of what inspired you to be connected to it. It's now that's all gone. It's just like your world is condensed to this thing that you're holding in your hand.
I mean, cognitively, you think about the fact that I would write down, like, let's say I was going to on the road trip, I would write down the directions, basically, like, you're going to get on I-35, you're going to, you didn't know how many miles, but then your next exit is this, and you kind of memorize that, but you also have to reference it. But then you also have to look around you and scan, like, when's that road sign coming? Do you know what I mean? Like, when's, it's like, and like, I don't, I know I don't do that anymore. My car basically tells me where to go, it just tells me when to turn right or left, And, so, you can think of it in multiple ways. Like, yeah, it's a different relationship, but maybe I'm using my brain in other ways. You know what I mean? I don't know. But I do like you're saying, that shaping of us is already happening, and the fact that we would have another relationship with a computational intelligence, it will shape us. I mean, it will change who we are as human beings.
Yeah. No, I'm so curious about how that's going to take place. I don't know. Right now, I go from like, one day I'll hear somebody saying it's the end of the world, and then another person critiquing that, and
Yeah.
there's just so much in flux with that technology. But I don't think there's a question about it being. It's going to be probably one of the most impactful things that we've seen, technological
Yeah.
wise, and just shaping of society wise.
Yeah. No,
So it's
I think you're right. It will definitely. I mean, it's a moment where we're going to, right now, I think we kind of see it as a tool, and it's like taking away a job, or it's like making an experience less interesting. You know what I mean? Like there's these kind of things, but the bigger picture part is one that it's a new relationship with an entity that we just haven't seen before. And that alone is something I think will change us as human beings, and that's. I don't see it as a bad thing, though. I mean, we've had these kind of, things happen to us many different times,
Yeah, I think every new thing has its detriments and its it'll contribute a lot and it'll take something away, and
Yeah.
it's a new world. It's sort of like the control Earth idea, like we could sit here and study all the data about why, what our life is like in the most ideal state yesterday,
Right.
and then try to map tomorrow to look just like yesterday.
Right.
But
Yep.
it's a new dynamic, and there's new technologies coming in, and there's new factors, and yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I find very interesting to kind of like relate it back to landscape architecture is that it's clearly changing the shape, the face of employment just in general, like which jobs stay, which jobs alter. Coding, I understand, is probably going to be like one of those jobs that's going to take a big hit because AI will be able to.
Yep.
But what you're doing with landscape architecture, I think, is sort of like it's almost like a beacon for, I think, where the profession likely will go. It's not like I think it's going to, one of the evolutionary aspects of landscape architecture is that there's so many ways to incorporate technology
Yeah.
that I think our profession's going to thrive, unless it just completely takes over everything and it's just like running the earth, Then maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you're leading the way to where we're sort of like relieved from that aspect and we move on to other pursuits. But at least in the near term, it seems like I don't know that it's going to overthrow the history of landscape architecture, but it's a new arena. It's not even just like a new practice. It's like a new entire arena that's being added to what landscape architecture can and should do, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I would, I do believe our role, like my kind of interest over time with landscape architecture has been around our ability to work at these very large scales and within these very complex systems. And, that's where my kind of interest in kind of physical modeling and computational modeling kind of took off after the kind of the more visualization side of things. But I've, what I've been frustrated with is that we don't really have the tools to do that job. Like we profess to be able to kind of design these kind of large territories. And we oftentimes do a pretty good job about representing how the different constituent parts may work together and the system may work. But it's always, it's very reductive in terms of the way we approach that. And I would say that without us knowing necessarily or being so kind of critical of it, it's oftentimes a compositional exercise at that scale. And it's like we cannot get away from that. I mean, that's just the way we've been trained in some ways. And so this is where my frustration, maybe 10 years ago also with what we were doing. What I saw was we're making a lot of maps of things. We're describing them through maps, or we're describing them through kind of maybe something experiential, but primarily through maps and data. We're talking about tools that might engage that, but we're never really getting at like how they get to the ground and do something. And I think that's where I find some of these kind of tools and ways of like just methodologies and kind of collaborations with machine intelligence being so being so interesting to me for landscape architecture, because I think it's we can think of it as like, oh, I learned Photoshop and now we have things like Midjourney that took that kind of skill away. But in reality, it's more about how do we use this as a way to engage this this complexity that we love so much about the environment, right? And that I think we don't want to be reductive about,
Yeah. So let's say historically we would work with like a Macargian overlay or like a GIS situation that has these waterways and fire zones or whatever things mapped out, and you start to overlay them and kind of like identify sensitive zones. Or
Exactly.
how does that with the machine learning and AI or just different technologies, how does that get how do we layer in that additional aspect of complexity and understanding some of these more, I guess, complex dynamics?
Yeah. So I think
a big piece of land.
This is where I think one of the bigger kind of projects that we need to engage in as designers, and this is for landscape architects, I would say architects, almost all designers, is is not just how these intelligences are developing, but it's the gateways to interact with them. And I think that for me is the so like, what are the interfaces? What are the tools? What are the deployments? How do we design those? Because that's where our relationship with them is fostered, right? Like if we just let them go do their thing, we're not really that, it's not, we're not gaining much from that. And so like, how do we kind of continually create these kind of gateways into the way they're thinking? And part of that's, I think, for us to expand our own thinking, right? And that's that relationship is the one that I think is interesting for us as designers. We've talked about the kind of idea that it could go off and manage a complex system in its own way, like we do as humans, right? It has that capacity in certain ways. But what's interesting is like we might take one anthropogenic approach. This might take another kind of machine approach. How do we learn from one another? And it's learning from us, so how do we come back to, and learn more from it? So I think that's a place for designers to really like work within, and you probably, this is not like news, but you probably understand this, but like something like these, DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, these image generation machine learning algorithms, as humans, we're like typing in a prompt that has like these objects in it, or like kind of context to it, and tools to take the picture, even things like that, right? And these are the ways we think of the world around us, through these objects, through these contexts, through these kind of phenomena. And I mean, this as well as I do, but I always have to come back to it, because it's taking that text string, and it's not concerned with the objects. It doesn't really care at all about the objects, right? It's simply mapping words to pattern, and it's doing that close enough that we're convinced that it knows what a rabbit is, or that it knows what a palm tree is, and in reality, it's just like looking at millions of images, and it's saying that the images that had palm trees associated with them had this distribution of RGB values across it, and so I'm going to use that distribution, and it should work for these people. Do you know what I mean? So it's like that fact that we derive that as some sort of intelligence, I think there's something to learn from that, because it talks a bit about kind of how we're engaging with things, but that different way of seeing the world, I think, is one that if we can see it and unpack it and engage it, it's our creation. And in some ways, like, why wouldn't we want to get deeper into understanding how our creation is like thinking about the world around us, And so that doesn't mean we need to know the kind of code and things like this, but what are the interfaces we make that allow us to communicate more deeply with it, right?
God, that's a really tricky thing too.
Yeah, no,
Just the
I think it
idea
definitely.
of, yeah, like how do you even the communication back and forth and trying to establish some.
Yeah, yeah. And you think about it. You think about it at the moment. Most of those efforts are ones where the machine learning or the AI is attempting to fake us into believing that it is smart in some way, or that it holds some kind of weight with humans. You know what I mean? Like those are the ones that that's what it's essentially doing, right? Um, there's I guess I'm just talking about the other way around. Like, how do we somehow intrigue it? Like, is there a way that we can get like what would that even mean?
I heard of just recently. I have a couple points on, but
Yeah.
recently I heard a podcast. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about the. This is specific to these language models, but that your prompting is very important, and that
Hmm.
he does it in a certain way where um, he's repeating the same questions over and over again with slightly tweaked language.
Right.
And the
Yep.
way he talks about it is that it puts it into like almost like a hypnotic state.
I
And by
see.
doing it in certain ways, you can circumvent some of the like safety controls, or you can access a more complete thing that comes back to you. But you have to do it in certain ways because
Yeah.
of just how it's structured.
Kind of,
I don't understand enough
kind
about
of
it.
tease it out. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
one thing I have found with Chat GPT that maybe I've spent too much time on there, but one thing that it's like starting to bring up a topic, but then asking it, like, once you get a little bit into that topic, like, can you ask me 5 questions about this topic that are like focused on this aspect of it? You know what I mean? And then seeing what 5 questions it brings back to you, because then you can answer those 5 questions for it, and it will be able to come back again with like even more distinct ways of talking about it. You know what I mean? And so
Uh,
I've done that, and what I've done that several times with ChatGPT, because it suddenly like hones in very specifically on those questions. It knows how to talk. It like almost like builds up a knowledge around them and knows how to talk about them. And then it also typically teaches me something about like what I thought those answers might be, and then what ChatGPT is finding out there. You know what I mean? Or
yeah, that's
processing with them.
fascinating. You know what I heard just this week though is that there was a teacher that did a thing with his students and had wrong information. Like it had just
Okay.
made up the
Yeah.
information
Yeah.
and came up with like papers that were published and like legal precedents that were never real. Things like
Yeah.
that. That to me, you had mentioned it, soliciting it to be interested in us
Right. Right.
or to impress us. It sounds
Yeah.
like a similar thing where it's like it wants to give you everything, but if it doesn't find it, it'll then like put its own thing in there to be able to deliver almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's wanting to serve.
I have heard that also, and that's like where that's going is like that's I mean those are those are really kind of interesting kind of moments in my mind. I mean there is I mean, and this is another once again like internet news, but that I think it was on Ars Technica, and I'm trying to remember what kind of if it was like OpenAI who runs ChatGPT. They're running through. They're basically being very careful. Have been running through kind of security tests about like how like what it's doing, what it can do. And one of the hurdles it made through one of the kind of security tests was that it was able to solve a CAPTCHA, and pretend that it was human. And the way it did it was so interesting, because what it did is it went to TaskRabbit, it hired somebody from TaskRabbit to do the CAPTCHA for it, and in the chat, I guess log, the person asked like, why are you having me do this? And instead of saying because I'm a AI, it said I have a visual impairment and I can't do these CAPTCHAs. So it lied in order to get this person to do the CAPTCHA for it, which I find completely, that's crazy. I mean, it's like it's has this little it had a nefarious moment of like it needed to complete this task and it figured out how to do it.
Yeah, yeah. God, how do you? I mean, so ethics. You know what I mean? Because I don't know. There's situations where it's as a
Yeah,
fundamental
that's
concept
great.
of life.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a mechanism to protect truth in a dishonest world,
yeah,
except for in moments when you're confronted with dishonesty and you have to decide what is the best for the people around you.
right,
So
right,
let's say, I mean, the perfect example is like Holocaust. You have Nazis coming to the door.
yeah,
Where are you hiding anyone? No, I'm not hiding anyone. And there's like 5 people downstairs.
right, yeah,
So how do you embed that kind of
yeah,
nuance and situational ethic,
right,
time,
yeah.
a time component?
I mean, interestingly, like that last example, it's like it's finding its own path through that, right? I mean, in some ways, I mean, it's obviously learning, and it's learning from kind of what it's coming across, but like, you know, maybe if has learned that lying is actually not an issue. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a human, some sort of human construct that like doesn't matter, and that there's that, but or in that case, it's outweighing like honesty over like needing to complete the goal, So I think I find that really interesting. It's like and it's in these are some of those changes that I think are going to be like culturally, and this is why I go back to this in terms of like landscape architecture and design, and particularly in our relationship with the natural world around us. These kind of cultural shifts are going to be the big changes, I think, that are the ones that we're not as aware of, right? And it's it's similar to just how like this generation grew up with like this generation, right? After us grew up with social media and everything. Like they have a changed view of the world, and this next like our whole society is going to have a changed view when we're confronted with these moments like this that are that question kind of humans kind of needs for like truth, or what we believe like our kind of our ethics are, right? And yeah, those are things that I think will be interesting. I mean, you can imagine like kind of a machine learning algorithm. It's like saying like actually probably the best next step for the rainforests are to actually cut them all down and allow them to regrow over the next 100 years. It's going to be bad for humanity, but it's going to actually produce greater biodiversity in the next next millennia. I mean, it's like there are these like kind of choices there that are like it's people may suffer, but the bigger goal is that planet Earth will come out on top of that. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
I think it's more complicated than those kind of really straightforward ones. They're more about what you were talking about, these kind of slow kind of changing of human beings. But some of those might be these resistances that I think would actually shape us in interesting ways.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking like it. So assuming well, my understanding is that it was trained on. I mean, it could have just like, here's one email where somebody's saying, "Did you do this in this more positive direction?"
Right.
Because we get better feedback from. In our profession, there will be something like that where
Right.
we're interfacing with computers, and we notice that as we
Yeah.
do it in a certain way, it is better, and if we do it in a different way.
Yeah, no, I believe that's that's what we
Yeah.
are as human beings. We are continually sculpted and changed, but these are, as you're saying, they have multiple kind of ways of like sculpting us. Some of them may be intentional on their part, others may be completely unintentional. But there's those two kind of in concert with each other, which I think are quite interesting. And I think this is we're saying it about humans. I think this is where kind of like the biological and geomorphological structure of the planet, right, have the ability to be reshaped as well. We've done it as humans. We're introducing another intelligence that has access to some of these kind of infrastructures and kind of abilities to control these larger systems. They will have similar kind of ways to begin to reform that matter.
Yeah. God, that's so exciting. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's totally exciting.
The the difference between wilds and wilderness, I think, is a good frame.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen a change in the student body over the last, 20, 25 years. I mean, I would say that, there's a couple things that like, there's a huge evolution in terms of just, I'll just say empathy and care for one another. Like I've never been around a generation of people who are so kind of in tune with caring for one another, right? And that's something I think that it comes. It's just different than I think the way I was raised. Not that I wasn't raised to care for people because I certainly was, but I think being born in the 1970s, growing up in the 90s, there was a like feelings of pain and feelings of suffering and things like this. Not that I went through real suffering, but those were normal parts of our lives. I mean, like we broke bones. We went out and partied and like got lost and woke up in a park somewhere. All kinds of, like, I'm just saying like my parents would let me leave for the day and I might not come back until the next day, with one phone call late at night. So like, all I'm saying is like, there's a range of feeling in that, I think we also then saw other people's pain as, was okay. People hurt, people suffer. Like these things happen. I mean, this is my own kind of anecdotal kind of version of this. But I see with students, like they have like a lower kind of set of those kind of emotions and where they go, and I mean a lower range. But it makes them care for each other in ways that are like that I think really support one another, and that's something really beautiful that I see in students today. Um, and I think that there's a range of reasons that's happening. I think as a society, we have less suffering in it, than we have, even from my childhood. But at the same time, I think these kids have been attuned to that, the way they're raised, the way their parents have raised them. Do you know what I mean? All of those things. Um, but then that translates to, them being interested in issues and wanting to take on issues that I think my generation might not have seen as important. I mean, we might have seen it as like, this is competition. Some people don't make it, and other people do. I mean, that's not, no one ever says that or thought that, but I think in the back of people's minds, there's a version of that world that was out there before, probably the last 15 years. And these kids I say kids that, I teach graduate students, they're adults, but they're leading that charge and they're going to change the world in ways that I think are really important. And as designers, their interest, I find the students I'm teaching are much more interested in those sets of issues that help shape the kind of sociocultural realm and the kind of biophysical realm that are about kind of care and relationships. You know what I mean? And that to me is like really makes me very optimistic about the world ahead of us. It's one that it shapes it in ways that can be kind of cheesy and say it's about love, but it's this idea that everyone has something to contribute. Everyone has something to put into the world, and it's worth taking the time to make sure that they have their voice at the table. And I see that in the small microcosm of the classroom. Much more than I did when I was in school. So I think that part's really amazing. I do think they're in a very tough moment where they are. Every single image, every single sound, every single video is at their fingertips, you know what I mean? And there is very little myself as a kid, I took a lot of pride in like cultivating my set of movies and music and like, you know what I mean? Like I had this group, I had my friends that we liked these certain things. But we were like wanted to be cool because we knew things other people didn't know, kind of, you know what I mean? And in a weird way, maybe I'm old and I just don't know what the hell they're up to. But in some ways, I see them as like almost seeing it all already, and then they need to do something with that. And that's a really, as a designer, that's a tough place to be, I think, in some sense. You know what I mean? Because you haven't kind of cultivated that individual style for yourself in some sense, and it's almost like everything's out there already. So what are you putting into it? And that's where I see this kind of like idea about care coming out a lot. But as a kind of designer that's developing an aesthetic and kind of an approach to kind of formal design and the shaping of the world around us, it's like all out there, right? And so it's like if I just do a search, a Pinterest board is going to come up with everything on it, or Google's going to show me everything pretty quickly, you know?